I stood by the casket with my hands folded in front of me. Not praying, not crying, just ... folding. His face didn't look like him. The funeral home had done what it could, but they had softened the lines around his mouth, removed the little dip between his brows. Those were the parts I used to touch in the dark. The face in that box was a suggestion of him. Not him. Someone behind me cleared their throat, loud. Then I heard it. She said it softly, but not too softly. I was meant to hear it's time she let go. Her voice was clipped, tired of patience. One of my daughter-in-law's sisters, or cousins, or maybe a coworker. I never learned who was who after the third year. They were interchangeable women in black dresses who called me Mom when they needed something and Linda when they didn't. Let go of what, exactly? Of the man I fed through a straw for the last 4 months. The man I turned in bed every 4 hours with wrists that now ached when I picked up a kettle. The man whose left hand still closed around my pinky even the night before he died. They said it as if I was holding on to some kind of fiction. As if grief were a possession I was hoarding for attention. I stood there and listened to them start. A conversation about catering, about how dry the chicken was, about where the children should sit. When I didn't turn around, they moved on. I had picked the hymns. I knew what he wanted. But the music barely filled the church, just floated like dust in stale light. My son, Evan, gave the eulogy. He talked about Dad's firm handshake, about the sound of him coming home from work, about Saturday pancakes and lawn mowing rituals. I waited to hear the part about how I held him upright in the shower when he couldn't stand. How I learned to clean a feeding tube with one hand and dial hospice with the other. But I suppose that was too intimate, too maternal, too real. I was standing alone when they brought me the flowers, big white lilies, sterile and cold. Evan stood beside me like he was doing a chore. His wife didn't meet my eyes. He looked at me, finally, and said it flat. "You have to let go now, Mom. You've been in that house too long." I nodded, but my hand stayed folded. I looked at the casket again, not because I expected it to move, but because I wanted to memorize what they had done to his face so I could tell him later wherever he was. I wanted to say they made you look like someone who never worried. They made you look like a man with no regret. I left before they lowered him into the ground. I had stood through all the performances I could manage. My feet were cold in my shoes. My purse had tissues in it I didn't use. When I walked back to the car, no one followed. I sat behind the wheel and gripped it. I didn't start the engine. I didn't even put in the key. I just sat with my hands resting where they always had, 10 and 2. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I waited for something to come up in me, something to move. But nothing did. Nothing except one quiet, clean sentence. They want to bury me with him, too. And I said back to myself, with no voice, with no heat, with no shake colon, no dot, no dot. Now I'll continue with part 2 of the story. 1,000 words, the backstory and emotional history leading up to the betrayal. I met him when I was 23. He was 31 and already had a little silver in his hair, right at the temples. I remember thinking he looked like he'd been born to wear a suit, but I only ever saw him in work boots for the first 2 weeks. He was laying concrete on the new wing of the library where I used to shelve books in the summer heat. He said he liked the way I folded my hands behind my back when I walked, that I looked like I had something to teach. We had lemonade once in the shade of the scaffolding, and the second time he brought me a plum wrapped in a paper napkin. He wasn't romantic. Not in the usual way, but I trusted his silences. He listened without making a face. That was rare even then. We married after a year. No big church. No reception. Just the 2 of us at City Hall and dinner at a roadside diner where the waitress called me sweetheart and asked if it was my birthday. He wanted a family. So did I, though I didn't know how hard it would be. I had 2 miscarriages before Evan. I don't talk about them because no one ever asked, not even him. The only time I cried in front of him was after the second one. He just held my hand and said, "We'll try again, Lynn." And we did. Evan was born on a rainy Thursday. The power went out during labor. They lit battery lanterns in the corners of the room, and when he finally came, I remember thinking he looked startled by how dark the world was. I stayed up all night watching him breathe. I didn't even feel the stitches. I gave everything to that boy. That's not a boast, it's just the truth. I stayed home until he started school. I taught him to read before kindergarten. I used to iron his little uniform shirts until they were warm and flat like envelopes, even when we didn't have much. Money, he had new shoes. When he got older, things shifted, slowly like furniture pushed an inch at a time. He started looking at his father like he wanted to be him, and at me like I was something that came with the house. Not hostile, just uninterested. I thought maybe it was normal. Boys and their mothers. Distance is part of it, right? So I stayed. Useful? I baked the birthday cakes. I helped him apply to colleges. When he brought home girls, I smiled and made space. The woman he married didn't like me much. That became clear early on. I would offer to help with dishes, and she'd say, "No, Linda, we've got it." Not Mom, never Mom. At first I thought she was just nervous. But after a while, the invitations stopped coming as often. The birthday parties got smaller. Then they became phone calls. Then just photos and text messages. Eventually, not even those. Still, I kept showing up. Holidays, graduations, doctor visits. When Evan broke his collarbone skiing, I drove 4 hours in the snow to help him bathe. When their daughter was born, I waited outside the delivery room for 6 hours, alone, and held her first while they were asleep. I remember the exact moment I realized she didn't like that. The second week postpartum, she came down the stairs and found the baby asleep on my chest. She said sharply, "She needs to learn to soothe herself." Then she took her slowly, like I might not give her up. I left that afternoon. After that, I started to fade. My calls went to voicemail more often. They moved and didn't send the new address until I asked twice. I was always told they were busy. The kids had soccer. Evan's job was demanding. My daughter-in-law was tired. There was always something that made me the wrong kind of presence, too much. Too often, too quiet. When my husband's diagnosis came, they didn't even come with us to the appointments. Stage 4, liver. He didn't want a fuss, so I didn't make one. But I hoped, somewhere in the thick of my hoping, that Evan would understand. That seeing his father reduced would bring him back to me. He didn't. He came twice. Once in October, once at Christmas. He stood in the kitchen like a guest. He asked polite questions about medication and insurance, then left before dinner. His wife stayed in the car both times. I told myself, he's busy. He's afraid. Men don't know how to grieve what isn't over yet. But even as I said it, I felt the lie stretch inside my chest like a pulled wire. Taut, ready to snap by the time hospice started coming, I didn't ask Evan anymore. I didn't tell him when we switched to morphine. I didn't call the night. I held a cup to his father's mouth and watched his throat forget how to swallow. I just did the work. I was his wife. No one else had the right. After the death certificate was signed, I sat in the dark with it for 2 hours before calling anyone. I stared at his name printed so flatly across the top. I thought, that's how they'll say I was his widow. A single line. No mention of sponge baths or night terrors or the quiet way his fingers curled around my wrist when he was afraid. No one would know. Not from that page. And no one asked. Not even Evan. It was always easier for them to forget how much I gave. That's the thing about motherhood. They remember the crusts you cut off. But not the nights you stayed up when they were coughing at 3 a.m, rocking back and forth in a chair with a warm towel on their chest, whispering stories to the dark just to keep your own fear from getting louder. I used to pack Evan's lunches with little notes in them. Nothing saccharine, just a reminder, you've got this. Or a small joke about a dog chasing its tail. When he was 12, he told me to stop. He said the other kids teased him. I stopped. But I saved the unused notes in a drawer. I looked at them again after the funeral. They felt like messages to myself, things I needed to believe. My husband, Robert, never asked for much. He wasn't a man who made declarations. Built his life the way he built the back deck with care, with patience, never rushing, always sanding down the edges so no one got splinters. But even men like that wear down, especially when the sickness comes in quietly, like a guest who won't take their shoes off. It started as heartburn, then fatigue, then the scans, the appointments, the hard words. I remember sitting in the passenger seat after the diagnosis, holding the folder with the biopsy results. He didn't say anything for 12 blocks. Then he reached over and put his hand on my knee, just rested it there like he used to when we were first dating. Was the last time he touched me without pain in his fingers. I told Evan over the phone. He listened, paused, then asked if there was a treatment plan. Not how we were doing, not if I needed help, just logistics. He said he'd look at flights, but he never gave a date. He texted now and then to ask for updates, but it was always on his time, between meetings or after games. I started keeping a notebook. Not for his benefit, but because I needed to see the weight of each day written down somewhere. I needed proof that it was real. There was a week in November when I didn't sleep more than 2 hours a night. Robert had started hallucinating from the medication. He thought he was back in Vietnam, even though he never served. He thought the bed was on fire. He called for his mother, long dead. I sat on the edge of the mattress and sang to him. Not because I can sing lie can't, but because the sound was the only thing that seemed to keep him tethered. Sometimes I think it wasn't for him at all. I think I needed to hear my own voice, so I wouldn't forget who I was. Evan sent a Thanksgiving card that year. No signature. Just a photo of his kids in matching sweaters. I pinned it to the fridge. Anyway, I wanted to believe it meant something. My daughter-in-law stopped texting altogether. The last time I heard from her before the funeral was when she asked if we'd finalized our will. It's not even a question about his condition, just whether things were settled. That was the word she used. Settled. Like we were a dispute in a bank ledger. Robert kept asking when Evan was coming. Told him soon. I lied. I let him die believing that his son would walk through the door. I kept a spare pillow fluffed in the guest room, just in case. Some nights I'd go in there myself and lie down on top of the covers, fully dressed, and pretend I was the one visiting. I'd imagine myself as a guest in my own house, being welcomed, being wanted. I didn't tell anyone when he passed. Not right away. I waited until the room smelled only of linen again. I waited until the air was still. Then I made the call. They didn't answer on the first try. I left a message and said, "He's gone." They called back 6 hours later. Voice cracked, but I couldn't tell if it was from grief or inconvenience. He said they'd drive up that weekend. I told him there was no need. The body was already with the funeral home. Everything had been arranged. He said, "You did all that already?" I said, "Yes, Dot." There was a pause. Then he said, "Well, I guess that makes things easier." I hung up the phone before he could say anything else in the week before the funeral. I sat with the funeral director and chose the simplest casket. Nothing polished, nothing grand. Robert wouldn't have wanted that. He hated waste. I wrote his obituary myself. I kept it to 6 lines. No fluff, no history lessons. Just the truth. Evan asked if I wanted him to speak. I said, "If you think you can do it." He said, "Of course." He rehearsed in front of the mirror the morning of. I heard him. Lines about honor, about strength, about his father's laugh. Not a single word about the last year, about the silence, about what was left unsaid. People kept patting my back, telling me I was brave, telling me I looked strong. I didn't feel strong. It felt like wallpaper. Faded, floral, stuck to a wall in a room no one uses anymore. After everyone left, I went into our bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of the nightstand. Inside was the folded paper I had signed 6 months earlier. Power of attorney. durable. They called it ironclad. I held it in my hands and thought of all the signatures I had made over the years. Permission slips, bank forms, medical releases. This one felt different. This one said, I carried him all the way to the end. No one witnessed it but me. And that was enough. I sat in that room until the light changed. Until the shadows started reaching across the carpet. Then I stood up, made a cup of tea, and sat down to write one last letter to myself. It began with my name, my real name, the one no one had, spoken in months. The letter was on the kitchen counter, folded, not sealed. A soft gray envelope with my name written in a hand that wasn't Evan's. I had gone out to get the mail, and when I came back, there it was. No knock, no doorbell. Just left for me like a parcel that didn't matter enough. To be delivered properly, I opened it standing up. It was polite, almost delicate in tone. She said she was writing because Evan found it hard to bring up in person. That's how it started. The rest was a suggestion dressed as a plan. We were thinking about the house, the upkeep, the bills, the yard. It wasn't sustainable, she wrote, for someone of my age. Maybe I could consider downsizing. Maybe I'd feel safer in a community with support. She even included a brochure. I read it twice, the second time slower. My tea had gone cold by the time I put the envelope down. That afternoon, I didn't call anyone. I didn't even cry. I just walked the length of the house, from the front door to the back porch, touching the corners of things. The wall where we marked Evan's height each year. The notch in the hallway where Robert dropped the toolbox. Back in '89, the little chip in the kitchen tile from when I dropped the Thanksgiving platter. They wanted me to leave all of it, sell it off like a used car. Neatly, cleanly, without fuss. I opened the brochure. The front had a picture of a smiling older couple holding hands at what looked like a shuffleboard court. The woman had white teeth and perfect hair. She looked like she belonged in a toothpaste commercial, not in any version of my life. The back listed amenities: walking paths, on-site dining, group activities, health monitoring. No room for silence. No room for Robert's chair, still dented in the seat from where he sat for hours with the blanket I washed twice a week. Number. Space for his books, for the cabinet where he kept the coins he used to polish with an old rag, saying, these little things matter. It didn't feel like a suggestion. It felt like an instruction with a smile on it. I left the letter on the counter and went upstairs. The bedroom smelled like lavender and lemon polish. I had opened the windows that morning and let in the breeze. I stood by the dresser staring at my reflection in the vanity mirror, not because I needed to see myself, but because I wanted to see what they saw. This woman, they had decided, was no longer capable. I looked tired. I'll admit that. My cheeks have softened. The skin around my eyes is loose now, folding into itself. But my back was straight, my hands steady. I could still thread a needle, drive at night, hold a tray of hot dishes without flinching. But none of that mattered. Not to them. To them, I was a widow in a too-big house, a responsibility dressed in polite grief. I started noticing things after that. Little signs I hadn't seen before. It's the way Evan asked about the property taxes. When he called, it's the way he said, we just want what's best for you, like the words were already rehearsed. The way his wife smiled too tightly, as if kindness were something she kept in a jar and didn't like to open often. Then came the voicemail. I was out trimming the hedges when the phone buzzed. Evan's voice, careful, like he was stepping around. Something sharp. He said he'd spoken to someone at a realty firm. Just exploratory, he said. Nothing binding. He mentioned the market, how things were selling fast, how it could help me simplify. He said again that they were only thinking of my comfort. I stood in the driveway with dirt on my gloves and listened to it twice. My heart didn't race. It didn't break. It settled, heavy still, like a stone lowered into a pond. The next morning, I checked the mail again and found the second envelope. This one from the county clerk's office. My hands stilled when I saw the return address. I hadn't requested anything from them. Not recently, Inside was a copy of a deed transfer. Form. Blank, except for the property address typed neatly across the top, our house. My house. There was a sticky note attached. Please sign and return at your earliest convenience. Below it, in Evan's handwriting, one sentence. We thought this might make things easier for everyone. Everyone? I stared at that word for a long time. Rolled it over in my mind like a coin. Everyone, not once did it mean me. I put the envelope down and walked to the study. Pulled out the black folder where I kept copies of everything wills, mortgage statements, the durable power of attorney, all the things I had signed while Robert was alive. I checked every page. My name was still there. My rights were still mine. I hadn't been erased. Not yet. But they were trying. They were trying to smooth me out of the picture, like a crease in a tablecloth. Kind words. Reasonable tones. Bureaucratic charm. But beneath it, I felt the truth like a hum in my bones. They didn't want me here anymore. I didn't throw the documents away. I didn't confront them. I didn't yell. That's not my way. Instead, I went into the garage, opened the cedar chest we kept under the old quilts, and pulled out the manila envelope Robert had left me. The one marked in his handwriting, only if you need it. Inside were copies of everything. We had discussed the house, the will, the final directives, and something else I had forgotten, his letter, written in a slow, careful hand, as if he knew I'd need to feel him after he was gone. I read the first line out loud. If they try to move you, don't let them. That was all I needed. Not a fight. Not a scene, just the quiet clarity of knowing. I wasn't wrong. They were. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid. Fear had already passed through me months ago, back when I used to lie awake listening for his breath. No, this was something else. Not panic, not sadness. Something cleaner. Like the first stillness after a storm. When you know the roof held. When you know what you'll have to do in the morning. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. There was a crack in the paint above the window, thin and crooked. I'd been meaning to patch it. Robert had noticed it first. He always saw the little things, even when he stopped talking as much. He'd sit in his chair with a blanket over, his lap and point with his chin. I would nod and say, I'll get to it, and I did, most of the time, but that one, I left. And that night, I decided I wouldn't fix it after all. Let it be what it was. By morning, I knew what to do. The first thing I did was go to the bank, put on a navy blouse, the one with the pearl buttons, no makeup, just lip balm. I didn't want to look like I was trying. I wanted to look like I belonged, like someone who understood her name still meant something. The branch manager remembered me. He said he was sorry to hear about Robert. I nodded, thank you. I'd like to make a few updates to the accounts. I had brought all the paperwork in a folder with post-it notes marking the pages. I slid them across the desk, watched his eyes scan over them. He cleared his throat and said, Of course, we can. Help with that, the process took 40 minutes. I asked for separate statements, new passwords. I changed the beneficiary on the account Evan didn't know about. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. More than enough. From the bank I went to the post office. I forwarded my mail to a P.O. box. Just temporary, I said. Just in case. The woman behind the counter didn't ask questions. She stamped the form and handed me a key. Small, brass, unassuming. But it felt like a key to something larger back. Home, I printed a new document and signed it in blue ink. It was a letter to the county clerk. A formal response. I wrote that I did not intend to transfer the deed. That I had not been informed of any pending transactions. That I was of sound mind. I included a notarized copy of my ID and mailed it certified. No anger in the words. No accusation. Just clarity. Then I packed a bag. Not everything, just enough. A few pieces of clothing, the envelope Robert left me. Small framed photo of us from 1977. Sitting on a bench by the water, both of us wearing sunglasses and laughing. at something I no longer remembered. K, copy of my will, updated that week, folded carefully in a folder marked private. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say where I was going. They hadn't asked where I'd been for months, so I knew they wouldn't notice right away. I left the house just after sunset, locked the door behind me, listened for the click. I drove through the dark for 3 hours with no music on. The sound of the tires on the road was enough. Each turn of the wheels felt like a sentence being finished at a motel off the interstate. I paid in cash for 3 nights. The woman at the front desk handed me the key and said, "Breakfast ends at 9. I thanked her and didn't correct her when she called me. My single quotes, Em. The room smelled like lemon cleaner and something older beneath it, something tired. I opened the curtains, sat on the edge of the bed, let my shoulders drop for the first time. In what felt like years, I was gone, and no one knew. That should have felt lonely, but it didn't. It felt like being alone on purpose. There's a difference. That night, I opened Robert's envelope again. His letter had only 4 lines each, written with space between them, as if he wanted to give me room to breathe between the words. If they try to move you, don't let them. You are not a guest in your own life. You remember more than they do. And that's your power. I folded it back along its worn crease and put it on the nightstand. The next morning, I went out early and bought a notebook. Wide-ruled, soft cover. Nothing fancy. I brought it back to the motel and wrote down everything. Every date, every message, every voicemail, every phrase that had clung to me like a burr. The way she said, "We're just looking out for your safety." The way Evan said comfort, like it was a product he could sell me. I wrote it all down, not for revenge, but for record. There's something holy in documentation, something firm. I wasn't going to raise my voice. I was going to raise my paper. By the second day, I started making calls. Quiet ones. I spoke to a lawyer I knew through Robert's old friend. I asked questions, listened closely, took notes. He said, "You're ahead of them." I said, "I know." I called the funeral home too. Asked for a second copy of the death certificate. They mailed it to the P.O. box. I picked it up a week later, wearing sunglasses and a scarf. I laughed at myself in the car afterward. Not because it was funny, but because it felt like something out of a movie I never would have starred in. That night in the motel, turned off my phone, I sat by the window with a cup of tea made from a bag I'd packed myself. I watched the cars pass on the highway, its taillights blinking red and steady. I wasn't going back yet, not until I was ready. They wanted a version of me that shrank, that complied, that signed forms and nodded politely. But I wasn't her anymore. Maybe I never was. I used to think dignity meant silence. That to be good was to be agreeable. But silence is only dignified when it's chosen, when it's not extracted from you like a tooth. That night, I chose mine. I chose everything. I waited 17 days before I went home. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I didn't leave any lights on the night I returned. I parked 2 streets over, walked with my keys in my hand, and let myself in through the side door the way Robert always did when he didn't want to wake me. The floorboards creaked, the same. The smell was the same to lavender and dust. No one had been there. They hadn't checked on me. That didn't surprise me, but it still left a hollow behind my ribs. Not a wound. It's just a quiet space that used. To hold hope, I unpacked only what I needed. I didn't turn on the big lights. I kept the kitchen lamp on low, the same way I used to when Robert would get up at night for a glass of water. The letter he wrote me stayed in my purse. I didn't need to take it out. I could feel its weight through the leather the next morning. I made myself a list. 3 columns. Legal, financial, personal. I had always been good with lists. I raised a household off them groceries, school schedules, insurance renewals, medicine, refills. But this one was different. This wasn't a list of things to manage for others. It was a list of things to reclaim. Line by line, I was bringing my name back to myself. The legal part was straightforward. The lawyer I had spoken to at the motel filed the necessary documents to secure the deed in my sole name. He sent me scanned copies. I printed them and placed them in the black folder just behind Robert's letter. I also signed a revocation of any power of attorney previously granted. I hadn't handed that power over yet, but I saw now how close they'd gotten to taking it without asking. I requested copies of all communication between Evan and the realty office. There had been more than I thought, a dozen emails. Subject lines, like exploratory possibilities for sale and just thinking ahead for Mom. One of them included a line that read, "She won't resist if we make it sound like it's about safety." That one I printed twice. The extra copy went into the fire. The financial column took more time. I moved half my savings into a new account. Different bank, different town. I didn't want them to be able to trace anything. Not that they would try, but I didn't trust what people were willing to do once. They decided you didn't belong to yourself anymore. I canceled the automatic transfer. I had set up for Evan's oldest daughter's college fund. I had done it quietly 3 years ago, just a little something every month. He never said thank you. Maybe he didn't even know. Now he wouldn't need to. That part of me was closed. The personal column was the hardest. It included things like, take down the framed photo in the hallway of all of us from Thanksgiving. 2011. Box up Robert's shaving kit. Keep the brush. Delete the emergency contacts from the phone. Update the emergency contacts to my own names. Some of those took longer. I left the photo up for another week before finally lifting it from the nail. I didn't smash it. I wrapped it in an old dish towel and placed it in a bin-marked storage. Then I crossed it off the list. I changed my medical proxy to someone else. My neighbor Donna, who had once driven me to urgent care when I fell trimming the hedge. She'd brought me ginger ale and a blanket for the wait. I told her recently, quietly, that I'd named her on my forms. She smiled and said, "I'll answer if they call." That meant more than anything Evan had said in years. I sat on the back porch that evening with a pen and the list, drawing lines through tasks until only one thing remained: reclaim the title knot of a car or a deed, the title they had quietly stripped from me. Matriarch, mother, person of value. That one didn't have paperwork, but I found my own way. I went to the county clerk's office on a Wednesday, wore my wedding ring, brought every piece of identification I had. The woman at the desk asked what I needed. I told her I wanted to update the name on file for the property, make sure it reflected my full legal name. She asked if I was changing. Anything else? I said no, just making sure the record was correct. She typed quietly, nodded, and printed a new copy. She slid it across the desk. 8. I read it once, slowly. Linda Mae Thornton, owner of Ricordi, thanked her and walked out into the parking lot with the sun on my shoulders. Back home. I placed that copy in the black folder too. Then I locked a drawer. The next day, I put the house on a different kind of list. Not for sale, for preservation. I contacted a trust attorney and created a simple living trust, just my name on it. No successors, no heirs. When I die, the house goes to the local women's shelter as transitional housing. I called and asked if they'd even want something like that. The woman on the line started crying. She said they'd never had a whole house before. I said it would be clean, safe, and fully theirs. I didn't tell Evan. I wouldn't. I spent the rest of the day in the garden. Robert's tomatoes had come back wild, stretching toward the fence. Line unpruned. I clipped them slowly, humming. I wore gloves, but still, the smell of the stalks got into my fingers. Green, sharp, alive. By the time the sun dipped low, I had a full basket. I went inside, sliced 2 of the ripest ones, sprinkled them with salt, and sat at the kitchen table eating them alone. Not lonely. Alone. There's a difference. And this time, it was mine. It started with the first voicemail. 2 weeks after I filed. The paperwork after I'd made the trust official and transferred the account. After I had changed my medical contacts and stopped forwarding my mail. The phone rang just before dinner. I let it go to voicemail. Evan's voice sounded different. Not angry, not yet. Just uncertain. Like he was calling someone who might not answer. He said he'd been trying to reach me. Said he stopped by the house and no one answered. He said the mailbox was locked. Then, like he was fishing for something. He added, I hope everything's okay. No mention of the transfer form, no apology. Just that light, polite concern people use when they want to seem innocent. I didn't call back. 2 days later, another message. This one from her. She said, Hey Linda, we've just been wondering where you are. The kids miss you? I sat on the porch steps with a phone in my hand and watched the wind move through the trees while she said it. The kids miss you. They hadn't called me in 8 months. Hadn't drawn me a birthday card or asked about my back since the surgery. They were sweet children, but children learn quickly where they're allowed to reach. I had been politely moved outside their circle. Now, suddenly I was missed. I deleted the message. The texts came next. First from Evan, then from her. Can we come by? What happened with the account? Are you mad? We're just trying to help. Each one a nudge cloaked in concern. No direct questions. Just that tone again. Soft, measured. The same way people talk to someone they think is fragile but inconvenient. I didn't answer those either. Then the emails started. They tried to sound legal, but not quite. He'd CC'd me on something he sent to the realtor. Said he'd been under the impression that the house was going to be listed, that there was a family agreement. I printed that one, highlighted those 2 phrases. Impression, agreement, I had made no such thing. The next email came from his wife. She tried a different route. Guilt. She wrote that she hoped I wasn't taking anything the wrong way. That this was a difficult time for everyone. That grief affects people differently. That maybe I was lashing out. Lashing out. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I folded the paper and placed it in the same folder where I kept Robert's letter and the trust papers. Not because it mattered, but because I wanted a record of how icily they rewrote the story when I stopped playing my part. A week passed. Then 2. That's when the posts started. I hadn't used Facebook in years, but I checked sometimes, out of habit. Out of that old, small ache that wanted to be included, even in pictures. Her status read, some people show their true colors when there's an estate involved. Family should mean something. Evan commented beneath it with a broken heart emoji. One of their friends replied, What happened? Are you okay? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. They wanted it vague. They wanted people to ask. They wanted to look like victims. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the screen for a long time. Then I closed the laptop. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain, because the truth didn't live in Facebook comments. It lived in the deed. It lived in the notarized forms. It lived in my hands, which had done every bit of the work for the last year while they had been too busy to visit. They could post. They could spin their little stories like threadbare blankets. I had the roof, the walls, the keys. The panic came quietly. Then louder, there was a knock on the door one afternoon. I didn't answer it. Through the blinds, I saw her standing there in a navy coat, holding something. A gift bag. Something pink inside. Crinkled tissue paper. I stayed still in the hallway. I watched her look toward the window, squinting like maybe she saw my shape. She didn't knock again. She left the bag on the step. I waited until dark to open it. Inside was a photo album, half filled. Mostly old pictures of Evan, one of Robert, couple of me, and a note. I hope we can find our way back. It was unsigned. I put the album back in the bag, walked it to the shed, and left it there with the broken garden tools. That night, the power flickered. A storm rolled through. I sat by candlelight in the living room and thought about how much noise they were making now. The same people who had told me, gently, that maybe it was time I gave up the house. The same people who had handed me a brochure for a place with on-site dining and games on Tuesdays. They were panicking now. Not because they missed me, but because they'd lost the version of me that made their lives easier. I wasn't answering the phone. I wasn't making nice. I wasn't bending into the shape they preferred. And so, to them, I'd disappeared. But I wasn't gone. I was just quiet. And this time, my silence belonged to me. The air felt different in the mornings now. Cooler, cleaner, not. Because the seasons had changed. Not yet, but because I had. I began waking up before the sun, not out of habit or duty, but because I wanted to. I liked the quiet before the world began talking. Before emails, before footsteps, before the phone rang with something it thought I owed. The garden became my clock. I would step outside with a cup of tea, wrap my sweater around my shoulders, and walk the narrow path between the tomato vines and the wild thyme. Things grew faster when no one was watching them too closely. I understood that now. Some afternoons, I would walk to the edge of town, past the post office, past the same cafe Robert and I used to visit after Sunday service. It had changed owners, but the wooden bench out front was still there. I sat on it once just to see if I still fit the curve of the slats. I did. That's when I met her. Her name was Josie. She worked behind the counter at the little bakery tucked between the florist and the antique store. She wasn't young, but younger than me, maybe mid-50s. Her apron always had flour on it, no matter the time of day. I first spoke to her when I went in for a coffee and came out with a croissant I hadn't meant to buy. She said, "You look like someone who still writes letters." I told her I used to. She handed me a lemon scone wrapped in wax paper and said, "Maybe. This will remind you." We didn't talk much that first week. Just nods, small smiles. She never asked questions. I liked that. I wasn't something for her to puzzle over. I was just a woman with silver hair who bought 2 croissants every Thursday. One for now, one for the next morning. It took 2. Months before she asked if I wanted to sit, we shared a table out back behind the kitchen. Nothing fancy. Plastic chairs, a chipped tablecloth, a view of the alley. But the sun hit just right at noon, and the coffee came in real mugs. She talked more than I did, about her brother in Arizona, about the stray cat that kept climbing onto the delivery truck, about how tired she was of small talk and weather forecasts. She never once asked if I had children, and I never once offered. She reminded me of someone I might have been if I'd said no to the right people earlier. One afternoon, I told her I was restoring the back bedroom in my house, just patching the walls and sanding the old trim. She lit up. Said her dad had been a carpenter. Said she still had his toolbox somewhere. And that she'd bring it if I wanted. She did. Inside were old screwdrivers with worn handles and a level with his initials carved into the side. I used it to hang a photo in the hallway, not a family. Picture a print of a garden path leading into fog. I liked that it didn't ask for understanding, just was. The bedroom took 3 weeks. When it was done, I stood in the doorway and stared at it for a long time. The light came in soft through the curtains. The bed was freshly made. The walls were pale blue. There was no history in that room. Just space. Just breath. I started sleeping there some nights, just because. There's something about choosing your own corner of a house, one no one else ever assigned you. It felt like rewriting my place in it. Josie brought over a set of curtains she'd found at a thrift store, off-white stitched with little yellow flowers. We hung them together in the late afternoon. She stood on the step stool and handed me the hooks. When we were done, we sat on the floor with glasses of lemonade and didn't say much. I told her about Robert that day, just the broad strokes, that he had been quiet, that he loved tomatoes, that he used to hum when he washed the dishes, she said. That sounded like the kind of man who didn't take up more space than he needed. I nodded. That was it, exactly. She didn't ask about Evan. People think silence is the absence of intimacy. But sometimes it's the deepest part of it. We had our own routine after that. Sundays, she'd close the bakery early, and we'd walk the trail. Behind the old mill, we didn't go far, just enough to feel the wind. One time she brought a small notebook, said she was writing poems again. I didn't ask to read them, just told her I was glad, and I meant it. It had been so long since I'd felt glad for someone without also feeling invisible. I started writing again, too. Not stories, not letters. It's just pages. Thoughts, observations. Sometimes I wrote to Robert. Sometimes I wrote to myself once. I wrote, "You are allowed to be more than what they remember." I folded that page and tucked it behind the photo in the hallway. I still didn't speak to Evan. The voicemails had stopped. I suppose they realized I wasn't going to reappear in the form they preferred. I wasn't going to bake sugar cookies for the holidays or babysit at the last minute. I wasn't going to hand over a house full of memory. It's because they found it inconvenient. Let them find new versions of the story if they need to. I had mine now, and in mine. I wasn't waiting at a window or sitting on a porch with a phone in my lap, in mine. I was walking beside a woman with flour on her apron and sun in her hair in mine. I was planting rosemary and hanging curtains in mine. I was still here. Not surviving them, living. The letter came in late November. Thick envelope. Heavy stock. No return address, but I recognized the slant of his handwriting before I even opened it. Evan always wrote like he was leaning forward, as if trying to get away from what he was saying. I let it sit on the table for 3 days. I passed it each morning, nodded to it like you would an old neighbor you don't speak to anymore. I didn't open it out of dread, not anger either. It's just restraint. I wanted to be sure I could read it without being pulled into something. When I did open it, I used the same letter opener Robert kept on his desk. Silver, dull at the edge now. Still did the job. The letter wasn't long. A page and a half. Number? Salutation. No, dear Mom. It's just a first sentence, like he was already in the middle of a conversation we weren't having. He said he was sorry. That things had gotten away from us. That grief made people strange. That his wife had been under pressure. That he hadn't meant for anything to feel so. Transactional. That was the word he used. Transactional. He didn't mention the trust or the transfer forms or the emails to the realtor. None of the parts with signatures or stamps. He kept it all in the realm of tone and misunderstanding. Said he missed me. That the kids missed me. That the holidays weren't the same. That he'd been thinking about Dad, that then he said something that stopped me. He wrote, "I think we all just thought you'd need us." And there it was, the root. Not that they missed me. Not that they worried. But that they thought I'd be alone, small, bendable. That I'd come to them needing shelter, guidance, approval. That I would shrink myself to be allowed back in. That I hadn't was what unsettled them. He ended with, "Maybe we can talk. No pressure. I'll come by the house next week, just in case you're open to it." I folded the letter slowly. Once, then again, and placed it beside the black folder. I didn't throw it away. I wanted to keep it not for what it said, but for what it revealed. The day he came, I baked a pie. Not because I wanted to feed him, not for hospitality, because it was what I would have done anyway. Apple with a little salt in the crust. I left it on the counter to cool, steam curling through the kitchen like a memory I could still enjoy without drowning in it. He knocked at 3:12 p.m., not on the door, on the frame of the porch screen. I saw his car first, still the same one-eyed. Helped him pick out 4 years ago, before everything softened into distance. I didn't answer right away. I let him knock twice more. When I opened the door, I didn't invite him in. I stepped outside, pulled the screen shut behind me, and stood on the porch. The light was gray, the sky just starting to tip toward winter. He looked older, not just in the face, in the way he stood. Like he wasn't sure what part of him was welcome. He smiled, small, said, "Hey." I nodded. He gestured toward the porch chair, asked if we could sit. I didn't move, just said, "I'll stand." He nodded like he expected that. There was silence then. Not the awkward kind. The kind that makes a person realize how long it's been since they truly earned your attention. He started talking about the kids, about work, about how the roof on their place needed patching. None of it meant for me. Just sentences trying to build a bridge. I let him finish. Then he looked at me and said, "I didn't handle things well." I said nothing. He shifted, said, "I thought you'd be lonely." I said I was. For a time, he swallowed that. Didn't ask for more. Then he said, "We should have talked sooner. Should have checked on you more." I asked, "Why didn't you?" He looked down at the porch boards. Said, "I don't know," which meant I do. But I don't want to say it out loud. I didn't push. He asked if he could come in. It's just for a few minutes. I said no. He blinked, caught. He hadn't expected that part. He thought the knock and the apology were enough to soften things. I told him I wasn't angry. Not anymore. It's done with the part where I made myself small to stay in the room. He nodded slowly, said, "I didn't know you felt that way." I said, "I know. That was the whole problem." He stood there a while longer, hands in his pockets, like a boy, being sent home early from school. Finally, he said, "So this is it?" I said, "It doesn't have to be. But it won't go back to what it was." He looked past me, toward the window. Maybe toward the pie dot, said, "I hope you're okay." I said, "I am." He didn't ask if I'd call. He didn't say he would. He just turned, walked back to the car, and drove away, slowly. Like the street was unfamiliar. I watched until the taillights vanished, then I went back inside. I sat at the table and ate a slice of pie, while it was still warm, and I didn't cry. Because there's a difference between sorrow and clarity, and I was full of the second. The days are shorter now. The sun folds itself behind the trees by late afternoon, casting long blue shadows across the porch. I find comfort in that quiet change. It's honest, doesn't apologize for withdrawing, simply does. I've come to enjoy how predictable the stillness is. My life pared down to what I choose. I rise early. I make my tea. I walk through the garden even as the frost starts to settle along the edges of the soil. The rosemary clings on longer than I expected. Stubborn, like me. The house no longer feels like a place I am keeping up for anyone else. It is mine. It has grown into the shape of me. There are nights when I sit by the window in the back room, the one I repainted, the one with the pale blue walls and the soft curtains Josie brought me, and I think about how far I've traveled without ever leaving this street. Grief was never the hardest part. It was the erasure. The slow, deliberate way they stepped around. Me smiling while they unhooked my place at the table. Making plans around me instead of with me. Speaking of me as if I'd already faded. There are bruises you can't see, but they ache just the same. It's the ache of being spoken for, of being managed. It's being gently moved aside like a piece of furniture that no longer fits the room. But now, I don't wait to be asked. I choose. I choose what stays and what goes. I choose what I water, what I store away, what I no longer explain. I see Josie once a week, sometimes twice. She still brings pastries wrapped in wax paper. We sit on the bench behind her shop, bundled in our sweaters, sipping coffee that's too strong but honest. Sometimes we talk. Sometimes we just sit. The silence between us isn't heavy. It breathes. Last week, she gave me a little wooden box. She said she found it at the flea market and thought it looked like something meant to hold beginnings. Inside was a single seashell, small, unpolished, pink at the center, rimmed with pale white edges like snow that's seen light. I held it in my hand for a long time. I told her I didn't live near the ocean. She smiled and said, "Maybe now you do." I brought it home and placed it on the windowsill in the kitchen. It catches the light in the afternoon, just barely. But I see it. I think often of Robert now, but not with pain, with stillness. I hear his humming sometimes in the rustle of the trees, or in the quiet drip of the faucet when the tea kettle finishes boiling. He was the last person who saw all of me without needing me to shrink. He would have liked Josie, and he would have been proud of how I stood when they tried to fold me down. He always used to say, "If you know what's right, don't whisper it." But I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to stop explaining myself to people who had. Already decided not to listen. I didn't go to Christmas that year. I wasn't invited, but even if I had been, I wouldn't have gone. Instead, I roasted a small chicken, lit 2 candles, played old jazz records in the living room. It was the first holiday I spent entirely alone, and it was the first holiday I didn't feel forgotten. There's a strange kind of warmth and solitude when it's your choice. I reread Evan's letter once, weeks after he left. I sat with it at the kitchen table. No tea, no music. Just the paper and me. I traced the word transactional with my thumb and folded it again. Then I took the letter to the backyard. The wind had picked up. The trees had lost most of their leaves, and the sky was low and gray. I placed the letter in the fire pit Robert built the summer after Evan left for college. I used to think we'd gather around it one day as a family, telling stories. But stories only matter when they're shared in truth. I struck a match and watched the paper curl into itself. No ceremony. No final line read aloud. Just a quiet burn. After the flames went out, I placed the seashell on top of the ashes. A soft, gentle closing. That was the last thing I gave them. The silence they never earned, but I needed for myself. Not because I was trying to be noble, because peace is not what you get from being understood. It's what you build when you stop needing to be. I locked the back door behind me, put the kettle on, and sat at the table in the dusklight, writing my name across a blank page. Not Mrs., not Mom, not the burden, not the obligation, just Linda. And this time I decide who gets to call me anything else.